Before we begin tonight's story, take a moment to subscribe and tap that notification bell so you never miss the chilling tales we uncover. The summer of 1978 draped itself over the quiet town of Millfield, Pennsylvania like a thick, suffocating blanket. America was caught in a strange in-between, 4 years after Nixon's resignation, still nursing the hangover from the free-spirited chaos of the 1960s. Across the country, the optimism of a new decade battled with the uneasy shadow of disillusionment. In Millfield, the air shimmered with heat and nostalgia. Fleetwood Mac's rumors played endlessly on car radios, and the scent of freshly cut grass mingled with exhaust from Chevy Novas and Ford Pintos. Teenagers spent their evenings beneath posters of Star Wars heroes and Saturday Night Fever icons, dreaming of galaxies far beyond their small-town lives. It was July 23, 1978, a Sunday, and by midday, the mercury had climbed to 93 GHz, the kind of oppressive heat that made asphalt ripple and time feel sluggish. On Sycamore Street in a modest two-story colonial home with paint peeling from the shutters, 18-year-old Elizabeth Blackwell stood in her bedroom packing a small brown suitcase. Each fold of fabric was careful, almost ceremonial, bell-bottom jeans, peasant blouses, and a denim skirt that carried the scent of summer air and fabric softener. Across from her, Abigail Blackwell, 16, lounged lazily on the twin bed, flipping through a worn copy of 17 magazine. The girl's room was a kaleidoscope of the 1970s. Farrah Fawcett's red swimsuit poster smiled from one wall, while John Travolta gazed down from another. A small turntable spun gently in the corner. The scratchy voice of Rod Stewart's "You're in My Heart," filling the warm air. Lizzie, as everyone called her, had just graduated Millfield High a month before. She was bound for Penn State University in the fall, the first in her family to go to college. Her plan was simple and pure: study education, return to Millfield, and teach children at the same school where she once learned her ABCs. She was radiant in that ordinary, timeless way, auburn hair cascading in soft waves, eyes that sparkled hazel green under the afternoon light, a constellation of freckles across her nose. To her parents, she was the pride of the Blackwell name. To her sister, she was a hero. "I wish you weren't going," Abigail murmured, twisting a strand of her honey blonde hair. Her voice was half whisper, half confession. "Who's going to protect me from Dad when he drinks?" Lizzie hesitated, her hands pausing over a folded blouse. "Mom will," she replied softly, though even she didn't sound convinced. "And I'll be home for Thanksgiving. It's just 3 months." She smiled faintly. "You'll blink, and I'll be back." But fate had a darker plan. Elizabeth Blackwell would never make it to college. By nightfall, both Blackwell sisters would disappear without a trace, leaving behind only silence, and a community forever haunted by questions that would echo for generations. That evening, as the sun sank behind the trees and the heat began to break, Mary Blackwell returned home from her shift at Woolworth's department store. The house was eerily still. The TV flickered in the corner, broadcasting The Love Boat. Dishes sat abandoned in the sink, half-filled glasses of iced tea sweating onto the counter. "Lizzie." "Abby," she called, her voice threading through the empty rooms. Nothing. Only the rhythmic tick of the hallway cuckoo clock and the faint sound of Charlie's Angels drifting through the neighbor's open window. By 10:00 p.m., panic had begun to bloom. Mary had already called all of the girls' friends. No one had seen them since that afternoon, when they'd been spotted walking the wooded path toward Lake Morrison, the town's favorite swimming hole. When Richard Blackwell came stumbling home from his weekly bowling league, reeking of beer and stale cigarettes, Mary's pale face and trembling hands sobered him instantly. "The girls," she began, voice cracking. "They're gone." Within moments, Richard had grabbed his Ford Ltd keys and was speeding down the old highway toward Lake Morrison. The yellow headlights carved tunnels through the dark, the hum of cicadas and crickets rising like an unseen chorus. When he arrived, the sight that met him made his stomach twist. The girls' bicycles were still chained to a tree near the trailhead. Their towels were spread neatly on the sandy shore, as if they had just stepped away. 2 half-empty bottles of Tab soda and a crumpled package of Twinkies sat nearby. But there was no sign of Elizabeth or Abigail, only the soft lapping of water against the rocks and the rising unease of a father realizing that his world had just changed forever. Richard's voice tore through the still night air, echoing across the dark expanse of Lake Morrison until it cracked from strain. Each desperate call of "Lizzie!" "Abby!" was swallowed by the water's quiet, mirror-like surface, offering no reply but the haunting chorus of crickets and frogs. By midnight, the Millfield Police Department, led by Chief Daniel Morgan, had mobilized a search effort. Flashlights flickered through the trees, casting nervous beams over tangled brush and damp earth. Volunteers from town trudged through the woods, calling the girls' names into the darkness. The department's lone patrol boat skimmed the surface of the lake, its spotlight cutting through the fog like a blade, dancing across ripples that reflected nothing but black. By dawn, the search had found no trace. Only exhaustion, sweat, and a growing sense of dread that settled like a fog over everyone involved. The disappearance of the Blackwell sisters dominated local airwaves the next morning. On WPN radio, the familiar optimism of Neil Diamond's Sweet Caroline faded out, replaced by the somber voice of the announcer relaying the scant details known about the missing girls. By that afternoon, Elizabeth and Abigail's school portraits, smiling faces frozen in time, were taped to storefronts all along Main Street. The headline of the Millfield Chronicle screamed across the front page. Lokams Vesfaram Akamarazon. It was 1978, a time before Amber Alerts, before cell phones or social media. Word traveled slowly, one phone call, one door knock, one printed flyer at a time. Volunteers churned out hundreds of copies on old mimeograph machines, the chemical smell filling the air as their fingertips turned purple from ink. Chief Morgan set up a makeshift command center in the Millfield High School gymnasium. Rows of folding tables lined the basketball court, cluttered with rotary phones, notepads and coffee-stained maps. A massive board displayed a map of Millfield and the surrounding county, dotted with colored pins marking every area that had already been searched. The atmosphere was a mix of urgency and quiet despair, the constant hiss of percolating coffee, the haze of cigarette smoke, and the low murmur of townspeople refusing to give up. During those first few days, leads trickled in, each one fragile, uncertain, and ultimately fleeting. A gas station attendant swore he'd seen a dark van without of state plates parked near the lake that afternoon. 3 teenagers claimed they'd heard screams from the North Shore, though they sheepishly admitted they'd been drinking Coors beer stolen from a parent's garage. And Jessica Turner, one of Elizabeth's closest friends, told investigators that Lizzie had mentioned seeing a secret boyfriend, an older man, not from Millfield. Chief Morgan, a steady man with decades on the force, pushed his small team to their limits. 4 officers worked around the clock, checking license plates with state police, interviewing everyone who had visited the lake, and dragging the lake's bottom in the hope of finding something, anything. They gathered what little physical evidence they could. Cigarette butts near the towels, tire tracks on the dirt road leading to the lake, fingerprints lifted from the soda bottles and snack wrappers. But this was 1978, long before DNA testing or digital forensics. The clues led nowhere. Within days, the story spread beyond Millfield. Local TV stations aired grainy footage of the Blackwell's front porch. Mary Blackwell appeared on camera, her eyes red and swollen, clutching a tissue as she pleaded through tears. "Please, if anyone knows anything about our girls, anything at all, please come forward. We just want them home." Beside her, Richard stood hollow-eyed and unshaven, his hands shaking slightly as the flashbulbs popped. As days turned into weeks, the momentum began to fade. Leads dried up, hopes dimmed. The FBI sent an agent to assist, but since there was no evidence of the girls being taken across state lines, their jurisdiction and ability to help was limited. Soon, the desperate drew in the eccentric. Psychics from as far away as Philadelphia arrived in town, offering visions and on-sites. One claimed the sisters were trapped in a cabin deep in the mountains. Another insisted they'd run off to California to join a commune. Each claim led to another dead end. By the time Labor Day arrived, the posters along Main Street were fading under the summer sun. When Elizabeth should have been moving into her dorm at Penn State, the search parties had dwindled to a few wary volunteers. The command center in the gymnasium was quietly dismantled. The folding tables and maps were stored away. The gym floor was polished again, ready for basketball season. Life, cruelly and inevitably, began to move on. But Millfield would never truly be the same. The laughter of children by the lake grew quieter. The woods felt darker, and the Blackwell home, once filled with music and chatter, became a house of unanswered prayers and shadows that never left. The Blackwell case technically remained open, filed neatly under unsolved, in the archives of the Millfield Police Department. But in truth, the investigation had slowed to little more than the occasional review of old evidence, rituals performed out of duty rather than hope. What no one in Millfield could have possibly imagined was that the truth behind Elizabeth and Abigail's disappearance was far darker and far closer than anyone had ever dared to believe. As the 1970s bled into the 1980s, time began to erode the immediacy of the tragedy. The once vibrant missing posters of the 2 sisters, bright smiles forever frozen in youthful innocence, faded in shop windows, their corners curling under the weight of years. One by one, they were replaced by Cabbage Patch Kids ads, local bicentennial announcements, and cheerful flyers for church bake sales. What had once been an urgent, town-wide crusade slowly became a ghost story whispered in hushed tones. The Blackwell sisters became the town's grim cautionary tale. Parents would invoke their names to warn their children. Don't wander off alone. Remember what happened to those Blackwell girls. The tragedy transformed into a moral lesson, the horror into folklore, and the truth, still buried, into something almost mythic. Mary Blackwell never recovered. Once warm and sociable, she withdrew into a quiet, grey existence inside the aging house on Sycamore Street. She quit her job at Woolworth's, stopped attending church, and rarely went farther than the porch. Neighbors often spotted her sitting in her rocking chair, eyes vacant, staring down the road as though expecting to see two bicycles appear around the corner. Her girls laughing, hair tangled in the wind, coming home at last. Richard Blackwell carried his grief differently. He buried himself in the endless grind of his job at the paper mill, working double shifts, volunteering for overtime, anything to avoid going home to the silence. Each night after clocking out, he made his way to Brady's Tavern, numbing the ache with whiskey and cigarettes until closing time, stumbling home long after Mary's tears had dried into restless sleep. On the first anniversary of the disappearance, Mary organized a candlelight vigil at Lake Morrison. Nearly the entire town came, hundreds of flickering flames reflecting on the black water as a local minister led a prayer for the missing girls. For a moment, Millfield seemed united in shared grief and hope, but the following year fewer people came. By the 5th anniversary, only Mary, Richard, and a small handful of the girls' closest friends stood on the shoreline, candles trembling in the summer wind. Every year on their daughters' birthdays, Mary baked a cake and set the dinner table for 5, herself, Richard, Elizabeth, Abigail, and Chief Daniel Morgan, who never failed to show up. He would arrive solemnly, carrying the case file, now weathered and stored in a cardboard box from the police station basement. Together they would go through the same faded photographs, the same typed reports, the same list of unanswered questions. Though nothing new ever emerged, the ritual gave Mary comfort, proof that someone still cared enough to keep searching. But time, merciless as ever, marched on. Through the Reagan years and into the Clinton era, the case gathered dust. The officers who had worked the original investigation retired, moved away, or died. Chief Morgan himself passed in 1993, taking with him decades of personal insight and notes never officially written down. The new chief, a young ambitious man from Philadelphia, had no emotional connection to the case. To him, it was just another relic, another cold file relegated to the archives alongside prohibition raids and town council minutes from the 1930s. In 2004, Mary Blackwell passed away quietly in her sleep. She was 72. She died without ever knowing what happened to her daughters. 6 months later, Richard followed her, his body finally giving in to years of alcohol and a failing liver. They were buried side by side in Millfield Cemetery, beneath a single headstone that read, "Beloved parents of Elizabeth and Abigail." 2 smaller markers flanked their graves, empty memorials for daughters whose bodies were never found. The old Sycamore Street house changed hands soon after. A young couple from Pittsburgh, unaware of its grim history, bought it and began renovations. Neighbors watched quietly, unwilling to spoil their optimism. But when the couple began cleaning the attic, they found a dusty box labeled in Mary's careful handwriting, "The Girls." Inside were pieces of frozen time, yearbooks, school photographs, handwritten diaries, and birthday cards lovingly preserved in tissue paper. The couple, unsure what to do, donated the box to the Millfield Historical Society, where the items were catalogued, boxed again, and shelved in a climate-controlled room among farming tools and old county maps. Pieces of grief turned to history. Meanwhile, the world moved on. The Berlin Wall fell. The internet connected billions. Cell phones replaced payphones, and DNA testing transformed the landscape of criminal investigation. Across the country, long-forgotten cold cases began to reopen. Crimes once thought unsolvable now yielding answers under the microscope of modern science. And then, in the spring of 2017, nearly 40 years after Elizabeth and Abigail disappeared, a phone rang inside the Millfield Police Department's evidence room, a place that hadn't seen a visitor in weeks. A new detective, cleaning out old boxes for digitization, had found something that didn't belong, a forgotten envelope sealed tight and marked with a fading date, July 23, 1978, and inside was the beginning of the truth. Nearly 39 years after Elizabeth and Abigail Blackwell vanished, fate, or perhaps something more persistent, stirred the still waters of Lake Morrison, uncovering what had long been buried beneath its murky depths. The event that would reignite the Blackwell case didn't begin with a tip or a confession. It began with a drought, the worst in Pennsylvania's recorded history. That summer, the once lush farmland surrounding Millfield turned brittle and brown under an unrelenting sun. Reservoirs shrank, rivers slowed to a trickle, and by late August, the surface of Lake Morrison had receded to levels no one alive had ever seen. What had once been a mirror, like expanse of deep, cool water, was now a cracked wasteland of exposed lakebed, scattered with rusted beer cans, tangled fishing line, and half-buried relics of the past. On a blistering afternoon, a group of environmental science students from Millfield Community College arrived at the site to study the ecological effects of the drought. Clipboards in hand, they measured soil moisture, took photographs, and discussed the implications of climate change. But what began as a routine field exercise quickly became something far more chilling. One of the students, a quiet sophomore named Hannah Pierce, noticed something pale jutting from the hardened mud near what had once been the North Shore, an area that had been underwater for generations. At first glance, she assumed it was driftwood, bleached white by decades beneath the surface. But when she knelt to brush the dirt away, her hand froze. The shape was unmistakable. It wasn't wood. It was bone, a human forearm, the smooth curve of the radius half, buried in silt. The group fell silent, the oppressive heat suddenly forgotten. They called the Millfield Police Department, and within the hour, the shoreline was cordoned off with yellow tape. The air filled with the low murmur of radios and the crunch of boots on brittle earth. Detective Samantha Riley, only 3 years into her position with the department, was among the first on scene. Calm but alert, she watched as the county medical examiner and a forensic anthropologist from the University of Pittsburgh carefully excavated the site. What they uncovered would send a shiver through the entire town. Not one, but 2 sets of human remains emerged from the dry mud. The skeletons had been eerily well preserved by the cold, oxygen, poor water that had hidden them for decades. Even remnants of clothing clung stubbornly to the bones. Heavy stones had been tied to the bodies with what appeared to be electrical cord, the fibers long since frayed and weakened by time. Initial analysis told a grim story. Both victims were young women, one around 18, the other 16. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the skull. Judging by decomposition and sediment layers, the anthropologist concluded they had been submerged for nearly 4 decades. As the coroner's van carried the remains away, the crowd of onlookers stood in stunned silence. Many had grown up hearing stories of the Blackwell sisters, whispered warnings told by their parents. Now it seemed, those whispers had been rooted in truth. Detective Riley, though born years after the disappearances, recognized the name immediately. She'd seen it before, on a dusty display case at the Millfield Historical Society, where the smiling faces of Elizabeth and Abigail stared out from beneath glass, frozen in time. The next morning, she drove down Elm Street to the old Victorian mansion that housed the Historical Society. Inside, among the scent of aged paper and varnished wood, she was greeted by Harold Jenkins, the elderly curator who had lived in Millfield all his life. When she mentioned the Blackwell case, his expression darkened. He led her through narrow aisles of display cabinets until they stopped before a faded photo exhibit titled, Millfield, The Lost Sisters. Behind the glass, 2 black and white photographs showed the girls. Elizabeth in her graduation gown, Abigail with her hair in curls, both smiling with a kind of effortless hope. "I was in high school when they disappeared," Jenkins said quietly. "Everyone thought they'd been kidnapped, maybe taken out of state. But all this time right here, under our feet." His voice trailed off, heavy with disbelief. Riley left with copies of the photos and a renewed determination. Back at the station, she dug into the old case file, a thick binder of yellowed reports, grainy Polaroids, and hand-typed statements. Despite decades of neglect, someone long ago had cared enough to preserve dental records, neatly labeled and sealed in plastic. Those records would soon confirm what Riley already suspected. After comparing them to the dental impressions from the lake remains, the medical examiner gave the official confirmation the victims were Elizabeth and Abigail Blackwell. After nearly 40 years, the sisters had been found, but identifying the bodies was only the beginning. The real challenge, the impossible task, was discovering who had killed them and why. The original investigators were long gone. Witnesses had aged, memories had blurred, evidence had degraded or vanished entirely. Yet Detective Riley felt an unshakable pull toward the case. A sense of duty not just as an officer, but as a woman standing in for all those who had once searched and failed. She began by digitizing everything: police reports, photographs, witness statements, phone logs, every scrap of paper she could find. She constructed a digital timeline, mapping the girls' final day in July 1978 from packing their swimsuits that morning to being last seen walking down the dusty path toward Lake Morrison in the heat of that endless summer. Piece by piece, she started to rebuild a story that time itself had tried to erase. And though she couldn't have known it then, The trail she was following would lead her not just to the killer's identity, but to a truth so shocking it would forever change the way Millfield remembered the summer of 1978. Detective Samantha Riley knew she was chasing a ghost. Nearly 40 years had passed since the Blackwell sisters' disappearance, and the trail was cold, colder than the depths of Lake Morrison where their bodies had rested unseen for decades. Still, she pressed on. Every scrap of evidence, every faded photograph, every half-forgotten memory could mean the difference between another dead end and the truth. Realizing the scope of what she was up against, Riley reached out to the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit in Quantico. If anyone could help her paint a picture of the person responsible, it was them. Within days, she received an initial consultation. The profiler suggested that the killer had likely known the sisters personally, someone who had power or influence over them. The methodical nature of the disposal, the use of electrical cord, the weighted bodies, none of it felt impulsive. It was planned, controlled, and executed with the intent that they'd never be found. Armed with that insight, Riley began re-interviewing the people who had once orbited Elizabeth and Abigail's world. Her first stop was Jessica Turner, now Jessica Mitchell, Elizabeth's closest friend during high school. Jessica lived just outside Millfield, in a modest two-story home filled with photographs of children and grandchildren, sunlight pouring through lace curtains, and the faint smell of lavender. When Riley arrived, Jessica greeted her politely but with visible tension in her eyes, like someone who had been waiting decades for this conversation. "I've lived with the guilt all these years," Jessica admitted softly as they sat in the living room. Her hands trembled slightly as she held a mug of tea. "I knew about the man Lizzie was seeing, but I promised not to tell anyone. She begged me, said I wouldn't understand. If I'd spoken up sooner." Her voice faltered. "Maybe things would have been different." Riley leaned forward, her tone gentle but direct. "What man, Mrs. Mitchell? Can you tell me anything about him?" Jessica twisted her wedding ring nervously, eyes fixed on the floor. "She never told me his name, said it was complicated, that people wouldn't approve if they knew. But she did say he was older, much older. I always assumed it was a teacher, or maybe someone she worked for." That lined up with Jessica's old statement from 1978, but Riley pushed further. "Did Elizabeth ever mention where they met, or how long they'd been seeing each other?" Jessica paused, closing her eyes as though searching through decades of memory. "I remember she said he sometimes gave her rides home, and she started wearing this necklace, a small silver heart. Said it was a gift from him." Riley immediately noted it down. The silver heart necklace hadn't been mentioned in the original reports, and that detail made her pulse quicken. "What about Abigail?" she asked. Jessica gave a sad smile. "Abby adored Lizzie, followed her everywhere, wanted to dress like her, talk like her, be her. If Lizzie had a secret boyfriend, I'd bet Abby knew who he was. Maybe she even met him." Those words lingered in Riley's mind long after she left the house. Back at the evidence lab, Riley reviewed the recovered items from the lake once more. Among the water, dulled artifacts were a charm bracelet, a class ring engraved with Elizabeth's initials, and, most haunting of all, a silver heart necklace, tarnished by years underwater but unmistakable in shape. Her heart pounded. The necklace was real, not just a memory. The forensic team had also recovered remnants of clothing and several lengths of electrical cord used to tie heavy stones to the bodies. Riley ordered comprehensive DNA testing, something investigators in 1978 could only dream of. She also requested chemical residue analysis, hoping to detect traces of oil, soil, or other materials that could connect the bodies to a specific location. While waiting for lab results, she continued to chase leads, tracking down anyone who might remember the Blackwell sisters. But most interviews ended the same way: polite sorrow, faded recollections, and "I wish I could help." Then one name surfaced again and again: James Harper. In 1978, Harper had been a senior when Elizabeth was a junior. Several people recalled that he'd asked her to prom, but she'd declined. Said she was already seeing someone. One former classmate remembered. Harper had left town right after graduation, joining the Navy, and had never returned to Millfield. Riley tracked him down to a quiet suburb outside Chicago, where he now worked as an electrical engineer, a detail that made her eyebrows rise when she considered the electrical cord used on the victims. When she arrived at his home, Harper was courteous but visibly unsettled. His once dark hair had thinned and grayed, and the lines around his eyes deepened as Riley mentioned the Blackwell case. "I hadn't heard about them in years," he said, shaking his head slowly. "They found them, after all this time?" "Yes," Riley replied. "At the bottom of Lake Morrison." Harper's eyes widened. "My God, poor girls. I always hoped they'd just run away, you know." Start a new life somewhere. Riley studied his reaction carefully. He seemed genuinely shocked, but she'd learned that guilt and grief often wore similar masks. You were close to Elizabeth, weren't you? She asked. He nodded. I liked her. Everyone did. But she wasn't interested. Told me she was seeing someone else. Did she ever say who? He hesitated, his brow furrowing. Not directly. But she said he was connected to her father somehow. I remember thinking maybe he worked at her dad's company or something like that. Riley's pen froze mid-note. Her father's company. You're certain she said that? Harper nodded. Yeah. I remember because she said it like it was supposed to mean something. We met where my father works, she told me. That's all. Riley thanked him, but her mind was already racing ahead. The Blackwell sisters' father, Richard Blackwell, had worked for years as a maintenance supervisor at Millfield Power and Light, a local electrical utility facility not far from the lake. Electrical cord, stones, hidden bodies, and now the first real thread tying it all together. Detective Samantha Riley sat alone in her office, the soft hum of the air conditioner doing little to quiet the storm raging in her mind. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above her as she sifted through decades-old files, police reports, and yellowed newspaper clippings. Each page seemed to breathe with the weight of the past, whispers of a tragedy that had haunted Millfield for nearly 40 years. Her investigation had reached a critical point. The evidence, though fractured and faint, was beginning to align into a grim and unmistakable pattern. Richard Blackwell, the girl's father, had been employed at the Millfield paper mill, once the beating heart of the town's economy, before closing its doors in 1996. The mill itself had long since been demolished, replaced by a sterile shopping plaza where families now strolled, unaware that beneath their feet once stood the place that might hold the darkest secret Millfield had ever buried. Riley tracked down the mill's old employment records from a regional storage facility. The documents were brittle, the ink faded, but they offered a glimpse into the lives of those who had worked there in 1978. She combed through shift schedules, payroll ledgers, and maintenance logs, searching for any name that might connect to Elizabeth Blackwell, any man who might fit the description of the mysterious older boyfriend. Then the call came from the state crime lab. The DNA analysis on the electrical cord had finally been completed. The scientists had managed to extract a partial DNA profile, not a full match, but enough to compare to a suspect should one arise. More importantly, the lab confirmed something chilling. Chemical traces on the sisters' clothing contained compounds used in paper pulping, including sodium hydroxide and lignin residue. The implication was clear. The girls had come into contact with materials or someone from the paper mill shortly before their deaths. Riley leaned back in her chair, her pulse quickening as the pieces began to align. Elizabeth's secret lover, the electrical cord, the chemicals from the mill. The web was tightening around a single horrifying theory. According to records, Richard Blackwell had worked in the pulping department, where he handled industrial chemicals and heavy machinery. Supervisors had described him as skilled but volatile, noting incidents of temper outbursts and inappropriate comments toward younger female employees. Complaints that, in the 1970s, had been quietly dismissed and filed away. Still, none of this was conclusive. It was circumstantial, hints of darkness but not proof of murder. Then came the breakthrough Riley hadn't expected. While revisiting the box of personal effects recovered from the Blackwell home, now stored in the Millfield Historical Society's archives, she came across a faded blue diary bound with a cracked leather cover. The handwriting inside was neat, looping, and unmistakably youthful. It belonged to Elizabeth Blackwell. Her breath caught as she began to read. The diary's entries spanned from January to July of 1978, offering glimpses into the life of a teenage girl, homework, friends, the excitement of college acceptance, and then, slowly, a shadow creeping into her words. She began referring to someone simply as R. At first, the entries were innocent, mentions of secret meetings, shared laughter, gifts. But as the months went on, the tone shifted. The writing grew more conflicted, filled with guilt and confusion. R says I'm the only one who understands him. Sometimes he makes me feel special, but other times I'm scared of what we're doing. Riley felt a chill run through her as she turned the pages. R says we can go away together. Just the three of us. He says he can get work anywhere with his skills, and no one will ever have to know. But what about Mom? The final entry was dated July 26, 1978, the day before Elizabeth and Abigail vanished. R says everything is ready for tomorrow. He says we'll meet at the lake. A new start for all of us. Abby's nervous but excited too. I told her it will be an adventure. R says once we're gone, we can be a real family. No more hiding. Riley's hands trembled as she read the last line. A real family. The words twisted like a knife in her stomach. She cross-referenced the diary's contents with the mill's employment records, searching for anyone with a first name starting with R. Dozens of Richards, Roberts, and Rays appeared, but only one had an intimate connection to both girls. Richard Blackwell. Their father, her breath caught. Could it really be that simple? That horrifying? She pulled up the original 1978 case file, rereading every line with fresh eyes, and then she saw it. The detail that had been overlooked or perhaps willfully ignored. According to reports, Richard Blackwell himself had discovered the girls' bicycles and towels at the lake, long before the police arrived. At the time, investigators assumed a desperate father had simply gone searching for his missing daughters. But now, in hindsight, the question screamed from the page. How did he know exactly where to look? Lake Morrison had dozens of secluded coves and trails. The odds of stumbling upon that exact spot were nearly impossible, unless he had been the one who led them there. As Riley pieced the evidence together, the picture became clearer and infinitely more horrifying. Elizabeth hadn't been having an affair with a teacher or co-worker. She had been manipulated by her own father. The secret boyfriend she mentioned was Richard Blackwell himself. He had groomed her into silence, convincing her that their relationship was special, that they could be a real family if they left together. But something had gone wrong that night at Lake Morrison. Perhaps Elizabeth hesitated. Perhaps Abigail threatened to tell. Whatever the trigger, Richard had killed them both, bludgeoning them and tying their bodies to the stones that would drag them beneath the lake's surface for 40 long years. Riley sat motionless, the diary open before her. The air in the room felt heavier, almost suffocating. If this theory was correct, then Millfield's beloved father figure, the man who had stood before cameras begging for his daughter's return, had been the monster all along. But Riley couldn't close the case on theory alone. Richard Blackwell was long dead, buried beside the wife who'd never known the truth. To prove it, truly prove it, she needed one more thing: evidence linking his DNA to the cord or the remains. If his biological material could still be recovered, the case could finally be solved. Riley exhaled slowly, her heart pounding as she stared at the words in Elizabeth's final diary entry. Tomorrow at the lake. A new start for all of us. No more hiding. She whispered to the empty room, her voice shaking. No more hiding, Elizabeth, I promise. The quiet town of Millfield had lived beneath the shadow of its mystery for nearly 40 long years, a haunting silence that refused to fade. Detective Samantha Riley, driven by persistence and an unrelenting sense of justice, took a bold step that would finally bring that darkness to light. She filed for an exhumation order for Richard Blackwell's remains. If the DNA extracted from his body matched the partial profile found years ago on the frayed electrical cord, her suspicions, long dismissed by many, would finally be proven true. At first, the district attorney resisted the idea. Digging up a grave based on what he called a theory seemed reckless, but Riley wasn't working off mere speculation. She returned with the old diary entries, the police reports, and a mountain of circumstantial evidence she had methodically gathered over months of painstaking research. It was enough to make the DA pause, and eventually, reluctantly agree. As she waited for the order to be approved and executed, Riley kept digging deeper into Richard Blackwell's shadowed past. The further she went, the darker it became. In 1977, just a year before his daughters vanished, Blackwell had been questioned about an incident at the local paper mill. A 17-year-old employee had come forward, claiming he made inappropriate advances toward her. No charges were filed, of course. Richard denied everything, calling it a misunderstanding. Soon after, the girl and her family packed their things and disappeared from Millfield entirely. Decades later, Riley tracked her down, living under the Arizona sun, far from the damp chill of Millfield. On a phone call that lasted nearly 2 hours, the now middle-aged woman confirmed Riley's fears. He wasn't misunderstood, she said bitterly. He tried to start something with me, something wrong, and when I refused, he turned threatening. Then came the words that froze Riley's blood. He told me he had special relationships with his daughters, said they understood him in ways no one else ever could. It made my skin crawl. But back then, no one talked about things like that. You just stayed quiet and moved on. That single statement solidified everything Riley had suspected but could never prove. It was the final piece of a monstrous puzzle. When the exhumation was finally carried out, the truth clawed its way out of the grave. DNA results confirmed the horrifying connection. The genetic material found on the electrical cord was an undeniable match to Richard Blackwell. Further forensic analysis only deepened the case against him. The cutting pattern on the cord perfectly matched the teeth of his old wire cutters, which had been stored among his belongings for decades. On a bleak November morning in 2017, Detective Samantha Riley stood before a crowd of flashing cameras inside Millfield Town Hall. The air was thick with anticipation and dread. When she finally spoke, her words cut through the room like a knife. "The case of Elizabeth and Abigail Blackwell," she began, "is now officially closed." The crowd stirred. Reporters leaned forward, pens poised. Riley continued, her voice steady but heavy. "After nearly 40 years of mystery, we can now confirm that Richard Blackwell, father of Elizabeth and Abigail, was responsible for their deaths and the concealment of their bodies in Lake Morrison." A murmur rippled through the room. Then Riley delivered the most chilling truth of all. Evidence strongly suggests that Richard Blackwell had been abusing at least one of his daughters when Elizabeth prepared to leave for college, threatening both his control and the possibility of exposure. He silenced them both. He killed them, then joined the search efforts, hiding in plain sight while the town mourned. Shock swept through Millfield like a cold wind. Those who had known the family, neighbors, teachers, co-workers, struggled to reconcile their warm memories of the Blackwells with the horror unveiled before them. Some recalled Richard's temper, his possessiveness, the way he hovered over his daughters. Others remembered Mary Blackwell's soft, spoken nature, the kind that seemed born of quiet fear rather than gentleness. And suddenly, what had once seemed like family closeness looked far more like captivity. For the townspeople who had carried the weight of this mystery for decades, the closure came with a bitter aftertaste. There was relief, yes, but also sorrow, guilt, and disbelief. How could something so vile have existed undetected in their quiet, tight-knit town? How could so many have missed the signs? A few weeks later, under a soft grey sky, the people of Millfield gathered at the edge of Lake Morrison for a memorial service. The wind rippled across the water, the same water that had hidden the sisters for nearly 40 years. Hundreds stood in silence, some clutching candles, others holding flowers. Jessica Mitchell, Elizabeth's childhood friend, stepped forward and gently placed a bouquet upon the lake's surface. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "Goodbye, Liz. Goodbye, Abby. You're home now." Harold Jenkins, head of the Millfield Historical Society, later arranged for a permanent exhibit, not to sensationalize the crime, but to honor the victims and remind the community of the dangers that can hide behind familiar smiles. It became a place of quiet reflection, where visitors could stand before the sisters' photographs and feel the weight of their story. A cautionary echo through time. When the remains of Elizabeth and Abigail were finally reinterred, they were not laid beside their father. Instead, their graves were placed beneath the broad shade of an oak tree, side by side, but far from the man who had taken everything from them. The town that had been haunted for generations could finally breathe again. Yet beneath the calm surface of Lake Morrison, the echoes of that terrible secret seemed to linger, a reminder that even the most peaceful places can hide unspeakable darkness. The sisters were not laid to rest beside their parents as originally planned. Instead, they were buried in a quiet corner of Millfield Cemetery, beneath the shade of an old oak tree, a place chosen to symbolize peace and freedom from the darkness that had once bound them. Their new headstone bore simple, tender words: Elizabeth and Abigail Blackwell, beloved sisters finally at peace. In the years that followed, the town of Millfield changed forever. What was once a story whispered in fear and disbelief became a lesson in courage, compassion, and the enduring strength of truth. Detective Samantha Riley, whose relentless pursuit had finally brought justice to the sisters, became more than an investigator. She became a voice for the voiceless. Riley dedicated herself to advocating for cold case investigations and for stronger protections for victims of family abuse. She traveled across the country, speaking at police academies and conferences, urging departments never to let the passage of time silence the search for justice. "Justice delayed isn't justice denied," she would say. "Sometimes it's just waiting for the right eyes, the right science, and the right heart to uncover it." The Blackwell tragedy also ignited transformation within Millfield itself. The town founded a crisis center for victims of domestic and sexual abuse, lovingly named Liz's Place, in honor of Elizabeth Blackwell's bravery and the life she never got to live. Schools began implementing programs that taught students and teachers how to recognize and report signs of abuse. The police department formed its first dedicated cold case unit, determined that no mystery and no victim would ever again fade into silence. For Detective Riley, the case was a defining moment, not just of her career, but of her soul. It had shown her that evil can hide in ordinary faces, that innocence can be buried for decades, and that the truth, though drowned, forgotten, or feared, will always find its way back to the surface. At the edge of Lake Morrison, where the sisters' bodies had once lain hidden beneath dark, shifting waters, a small bronze plaque was placed by the community. It reads, "In memory of Elizabeth and Abigail Blackwell, their silence was long, but their truth was louder." Now families walk those shores not in fear, but in reflection. The lake that once kept its secrets has become a place of peace, a reminder that light can rise even from the deepest shadows. In solving the Blackwell case, Detective Riley and her team did more than close a file. They gave voice to the dead. They reminded the world that time does not erase the evidence of truth, and that even secrets buried in lake mud and human hearts cannot remain hidden forever. As the waters of Lake Morrison returned to their calm, glassy stillness, covering the place where the sisters had lain for nearly 4 decades, Millfield, too, began to heal. The truth, though painful, had been spoken. The evil that had lurked behind one man's mask of fatherhood was dragged into the light, and the town that once turned a blind eye learned to keep its eyes open. The story of the Blackwell sisters remains one of Millfield's most haunting chapters, but also one of its most powerful. It serves as a reminder that justice may sleep, but it never dies. Like the lake itself, still and deep, the truth waits patiently to rise, and when it does, it brings not only sorrow, but the fragile beginnings of peace. In the end, it wasn't just cutting-edge forensics that solved the case. It was the past, the faded diary entries of a frightened teenage girl, the yellowed photographs, the brittle employment records, and the fading memories of those who had loved her. These fragments, when combined with the precision of modern science, revealed the horrifying reality that had been hiding in plain sight for 40 years. The case of the Blackwell sisters was officially closed, but their legacy continues to ripple through time. It lives on in Liz's place, in the Millfield Cold Case Unit, in the annual scholarship for students pursuing justice and social work, and in the hearts of a community that has learned to listen, truly listen, when silence feels heavy. Justice, though long delayed, had finally arrived. The truth, though buried deep, had finally spoken, and Elizabeth and Abigail Blackwell, though they never lived to see adulthood, had finally, after decades of darkness, found peace.